What is the creepiest encounter with a complete stranger that you have ever had? Story 1. I once gave a bloke a lift to the city center. He was a young man and extremely generous. He gave me a tip that covered the fuel cost several times over. However, there was something disconcerting about him. He said that he was going to have some fun and listed the places he would be visiting, and then would be leaving the country for a while. I thought nothing much of it, until I read later that there had been several attacks on young women in those areas. I guess he had his fun. Story 2. When my oldest son was a tiny baby, about 8 or 9 months old, we were in London for a weekend. We were on a tube early on a Sunday morning and it was pretty deserted. He was in his pram and we were standing by the doors. A really old lady got on, easily mid-80s or even older. Before we got to her stop, she leaned over and looked into the pram like old people tend to do. We arrived at her station. The doors beeped and before she got off, she looked me dead in the eyes and said, "He's got an old soul. He's been here before." She stood looking at us through the window as the train pulled out of the station. Me and the wife just looked at each other like, what the f***? I'm gonna have to remember that for when I get old to freak people out. Story 3. Last week I was on a 5-hour drive via the M6. There was a car in front of me and we ended up driving in convoy for a few minutes. I thought nothing of it. It happens on the motorway and when overtaking a lorry, I overtook him too. For the next 10 minutes he kept speeding past me, moving in front then slowing down repeatedly. Eventually he pulled beside me in the middle lane. This is very odd, I thought. Something's wrong. As he drove beside me, he maintained speed, making sure he stayed level with my car and trying to get my attention. I thought there was an issue with my car and I looked over. He waved. I waved. He started making hearts and kisses with his hands. I shook my head, but he wouldn't let it go. There was a lorry behind me and a car in front. I was pinned and his car was getting closer to mine with an exit coming, pushing me towards the left. I was terrified he would push me into the motorway exit and follow me down the roads with only one lane. The lorry behind then put on its brakes and I did the same, slipped out the new gap behind this guy's car and fled down the motorway, getting lost between cars. There have been many creepy things, but this got to me because even in my own car, going 70 miles on the motorway isn't enough to keep me away from creeps. Story 4. I was followed and then chased home after a night out drinking when I was in my 20s. I was walking alone down a long road at midnight. Someone from 100 meters back says, "Or you." I ignore, thinking why would anyone be calling me? 20 seconds later I hear, "Or you," again, and this time it seems closer. I picked up the pace but don't dare turn around in case it's aimed at me. After another few shouts in my direction and he sounds 50 meters away now, I'm walking as fast as I possibly can without running. Then I hear a roar of rage and I panic, turn down a side street, jump into a garden 3 houses down and hid under a hedge. About 30 seconds later I see a man running down the street shouting, "Where are you, you fucker?" I just sat there hiding for a good 10 minutes until I dared make my way back to my house. I still don't know why he chased after me or what he wanted, but I'm glad I don't know. Story 5. I moved into a house share that only had one person living in it at a time. On the day I moved in, I sorted my stuff and heard this guy get home. I went to the kitchen and said hello and asked his name, and he said he didn't have time for this and slammed a door and went upstairs. Shortly after I heard him scream. The guy unfortunately had grabbed a knife and had stabbed himself. Story 6. A man turned up to my doorstep with a jar full of dried noodles, mumbling and pointing to it aggressively. He didn't speak English, so I wasn't sure what he was doing, offering me them or what. So I politely refused and went to close the door when he stopped the door and said, "Water." Initially, I thought he wanted a glass of water. Perhaps my brain wasn't fully engaged on the request as much as it was on this strange man and his jar of noodles on my doorstep. Then I realized he wanted boiling water to cook his noodles. In total surprise, I had no other answer but to accept. I shut the door, explaining 1 minute, went into my kitchen and began to boil the kettle. For the non-initiated, it's a worktop appliance that we use to boil water to make hot drinks with. I started to lean on my worktop just thinking to myself, what on earth is going on? As the kettle boiled, I headed back to the door to find the man and his jar of noodles waiting patiently, and as he saw the kettle, he began to tap the jar with a smile on his face. I started to fill the jar and he raised his hand to gesture for me to stop. Not a word. Off he went, stirring his jar of noodles, leaving me standing on my doorstep wondering what just happened and if I had any noodles in the house. Story 7. The creepiest story I have to tell. Myself and 2 friends, all from the UK, went to Thailand for a couple months, and we rented a juicy van, which is like a camper van, I guess, and drove up the entire East Coast. One night, in the middle of nowhere, we stopped at a petrol station, or gas station. It was a station that just sort of appeared out of nowhere, with nothing but fields as far as you could see in any other direction. We We stopped for fuel, food, and hopefully a toilet and freshen up break if they had a restroom. We walked into the station. Everyone in there were what I'd described as hillbilly looking. They all just sort of stopped and looked at us as we went about our business. Got to the till. The cashier was super non-sociable. They did have a restroom and gave us the keys to it. We paid for our stuff, headed for the restroom to find it was covered head to toe in shit, grime, probably blood, and who knows what else. We said this and left the keys to the toilet in the door, jumped in our juicy van and left. But as we were pulling out, 4 to 5 pickup style trucks all sort of pulled in and half blocked us in. We found a gap between 2 trucks and sped out of there. The headlights in the rearview mirror seemed to last forever. We were convinced they were following us. Story 8. I'd be about 13 on the bus home from school. Everyone else had got off long before my tiny village stop. At one point it had to go past a mill at kicking out time, and 3 women would get on, probably late teens, early 20s. Wherever I say, they'd corner me, making comments about being their boyfriend, getting way too close, etc. I changed my routine/times home as a result. It was horrible. Story 9. As a 15-year-old girl, I went on an exchange trip with a Belgian girl called Sophie and her family. My mom had bought me some onesie-style pajamas to wear. One morning I went to the toilet and there was no lock on the door. I had to lower my PJs right down and was sitting on the toilet where her father opened the door. He didn't close it straight away, but instead stood there, had a good look at me, and then said, "What a lovely sight to see in the morning." He closed the door slowly, with no apology. I had another week to spend with them, which was difficult. I remember that my friend Sophie seemed to dislike her father. As an adult, I'd look back and wonder if she was being abused. Damn, I'm so sorry for your experience, and I'm much sorry for Sophie. Abusive parents are the worst thing that can happen to any child. Story 10. Aged 8, walking home from school alone. Small town, about half a mile, mid-1970s. I was stopped by a smiley OAP who told me his dog had puppies. And did I like puppies? Would I like to come and see them? I remember feeling both very confused and tempted, but knowing my strict mother would be furious if I was late home, I said no I can't, and walked away and went home. Story 11. District line, in my late teens. As a thin teenage boy, I could wear slated ripped jeans and get away with it. A middle-aged man came over to chat, and he quickly steered the conversation to the rips in my jeans, and what he'd like to do if he could get his hands in there. Story 12. When I was about 10, ITV used to show wrestling at about 1 a.m. on a Saturday/Sunday morning. My big sister would wake me up to watch it. One time, she was washing up whilst I was watching the wrestling, when there was knocking on the kitchen window next to the sink. A guy was begging to use our phone, saying it was an emergency. My sister told him we didn't have a phone, which we didn't, and to use the next door if it's an emergency. He insisted it had to be our house that he used. He couldn't use any other house. It took a good half hour for him to leave the doorstep. Story 13. 1982. Me and my friend were 10, female, and we just got new bikes for our birthdays, so decided to cycle the mile to town to go get some sweets. On the way home, there's a railway bridge you pass under, and then about 20 seconds later, a road you have to cross. As we were 10, we were cycling on the pavement and stopped our bikes to get off and cross the road. We'd passed a guy under the railway bridge who, looking back now, was maybe 22, but seemed like an adult to us. Suddenly, he was behind us, grabbed me and tried to drag me off to the industrial estate next to where we were crossing the road. I utterly froze, terrified. Thankfully, my friend went nuts, kicking and screaming at him to let me go. He did, and ran off into the industrial estate. I'm 50 now, but it still freaks me out that he had just 20 seconds to decide to act, and then try to take a little girl off the street to He hadn't been following us. We'd never seen him before. It was literally just a chance passing on the street. We reported to our parents and they called the police. Nothing ever came of it. I dread to think what he's done since. Story 14. Winter. I was underdressed and cold, huddled against the window of a commuter train on my way to work, trying to make myself small to keep warm. As the train pulled into a suburban station, a casually dressed black woman, mid-30s, walked over to me, staring all the while, and kissed me before getting off the train. I'm a dude, by the way. Story 15. When I was 5 or 6, mid-1980s, I was at a summer party for firefighters and their families near Bristol. It was about 7 p.m. on a very warm evening. I was playing on the swings with another boy my age, but without adult supervision, when 2 men and a woman wandered over and started talking to us. I remember one of the men stroked my hair and asked if we wanted to go see some puppies. My friend said yes, and I said no. They said we'd have to go in their car to see them, and they took my friend's hand and encouraged him to go go with them. I ran off to get my dad, and my dad and some other firemen ran outside when I told them some strange people wanted us to go off with them. My dad said, "Where are they?" And for some reason I said, "They've gone," even though I could clearly see them walking away across the park. I think I was just scared of a fight happening or something. I also distinctly remember Uptown Girl by Billy Joel blaring out at the party when this was all happening. I sometimes wonder who these people were, what exactly would have happened to us had we gone with them, and where they are now. Story 16. 9 p.m. on a Friday. Stood at a cash point just before Christmas. As the cash is coming out, someone pushes their thumb and forefinger knuckle into the back of my neck and says, "Give me all your money." I jump and start laughing, thinking it's a friend playing a prank. Turn around with a big grin on my face, giggling. It wasn't a friend. It was some stranger, bald, hoodie, tweaked up and jittery. He is holding his hand at me like he has a knife, but there's nothing in his hand. I can only say I was in some sort of shock. I carried on giggling. The lack of knife made it funny, apparently. I said, "You what?" He stood there a moment, then mumbled, "Give me your money." I let out a sort of ha noise, and then said, no. He stood there staring at me. I stood there staring at him. He stood there staring at me. I walked off. He stood there staring at me. It was a very odd encounter. Story 17. I was walking home from 6th form, and there was a guy walking ahead of me that kept turning around and blatantly staring at me. I tried to ignore it and was texting my friend telling her I was creeped out. He then stopped, turned around to walk towards me and asked me for the time. I gave him the time and then crossed the road. He started following me, asking if I had a boyfriend and if I wanted to go out with him. This man was definitely pushing 30. I was 16. I told him no thank you and literally sprinted home. I spent the whole morning in a state of fear in case he'd followed me back. Where this encounter happened wasn't far from my house. Thankfully, never saw him again. Story 18. Man at the train station told me I looked like his dead wife. Proceeded to try and talk to me every day, make inappropriate comments, and show me photos of said wife. I stopped leaving the house for a while and eventually changed my route to uni. Instead of a 30-minute train journey, I would take 4 buses, so my total journey was 1.5 hours. Terrifying. Story 19. When I was about 10, I was looking over my neighbor's rabbits, and whilst there, noticed a man looking in the window. I went over and said, "Can I help you?" And he didn't say anything, so I said, "They're on holiday and they won't be back until next week." That night, they got burgled, and when I told my dad about the man and what I said to him, he was like, "You idiot, didn't you notice the swag bag and the stripy jumper?" Anyway, I was mortified and freaked out, and I was like, he could have stolen me. We joke about it now, but at the time I was really creeped out that I spoke to a burglar. Story 20. Girl entered my tent at a music festival, asked if she could sit with me for a while. I thought, okay, she might be scared or overwhelmed and needed a safe place. Why my tent, I have no idea. I tried idle chat as she sat there in total silence, asked if she was okay, and still total silence. She just sat there, legs crossed, and will not move. I swear she was barely even blinking. This went on for a good 15 minutes, and then out of the blue she said, "Thank you so much," and just left. Either someone was playing a trick on me, or I just witnessed a Terminator rebooting. Story 21. I was 15, and some creepy guy from a takeaway that we ordered from followed me. He kept following me and kept trying to ask me for my number. I said I'm 15 and I'm not interested, but he still followed me. He then said he'd buy me cigs or alcohol, and I told him to get lost or I'll call the police. I was scared to go out alone for a while after that. The takeaway closed down a year or two later. Story 22. I used to work at an airsoft shop that was quite a long train journey from where I lived. Was on the train from Worcester at the time, wearing my company t-shirt and MTP combat trousers with my soft shell jacket. Some old guy on the train starts having a go at me, telling me I'm disgusting and I'm the reason why we're over in Afghanistan at the moment. Ignored the guy since he was clearly deluded / suffering from something. And I got off the train to meet up with the store manager and another member of staff so we could all catch the train to the store. Whilst I'm waiting outside the station, this random Spanish woman comes running up to me shouting, Tom, it's me," and proceeds to give me a hug and start touching my arm seductively. I'm completely confused at this point, and just as I'm about to say, "Sorry, you've got the wrong person," this guy walks up behind her, taps her on the shoulder, and looks at me with a face. And then I think it clicked in her head that was the guy she was looking for. We looked absolutely nothing alike. That was like 9 years ago and still haunts me as one of my weirdest days yet. Story 23. An old friend of mine grew up in Leeds. He remembers walking home from school and a van pulling up beside him. A wily-haired woman driving asked him if he wanted a lift, to which he said no. She offered him sweets and he refused. She then became very aggressive and told him to get in the van, at which point he turned on his heel and ran away. That woman, he thinks, was Myra Hindley. Story 24. Every morning when walking to work, I pass the same house at around 8:36 a.m. The guy who lives there has been emptying his recycling at the same time every day for the past 3 days, and each time smiles at me awkwardly. It's as if he's making excuses to be outside when I pass, thinking of changing my route to work. Very creepy. Story 25. I was about 14/15 and went to the cinema with my friend to watch Schindler's List. There was a middle-aged guy with a big beard sat directly behind me, and not long into the film he puts his hands on my shoulders and starts to massage me. I edged forward in my seat and he did it again. I kept edging forward until I was almost about to fall off the seat, but each time I did he would still put his hands back on me. I was too terrified to turn around or say anything. He then left midway through the film, and I don't think I've ever been so relieved in my life.